let's begin this discussion on the topic, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. A very famous quote by ancient Chinese philosopher or scholar, Sun Tzu. But we would rather discuss this without any reference to that scholar. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. It takes us, before we discuss, why do we fight war? What is the reason behind fighting a war? Why do we fight a war? We fight a war because we want our enemy or the other person, the other party, we want that other party or the group to do certain things which are according to our interest, which are in our interest, and which they may not want to do. So when we force our opinions, our desires upon them, and when the other party is not ready to comply, then there is a need for war. This has been the history of human civilization, and as pointed out by many of you, that why do we fight war? We fight war because we want to, sometimes humans want to grab territory of others, they want to grab resources of others. One of you pointed about, I think Avinash pointed out about conflict of ideas. Okay. Then I think the first speaker, who was the first speaker? Anand Goswami, you talked about gaining other people's resources. Okay. And Abhay Kumar also, he talked about in society there are issues. Abhinav Rathod, I think he talked about territory and how people want to grab territory. And also how we need to defend ourselves. Also, there are basically many reasons that why we want to fight war. The basic point here is that in all those cases, we want our enemy or the other group to take certain actions according to our interest, So this statement suggests that the best way of war is to do certain thing, that this action of fighting itself is not required. And how can that take place? How can that take place? It can take place in many ways, and this is what the essay topic is. How can you get your enemy perform certain actions or do certain tasks which are in your interest without fighting, without firing a bullet, without bringing your military might into action? So there could be many ways of that. Okay, I'll start with those suggestions which are not directly connected to this topic. What is exactly the demand of the topic, I will come to that in a while. But if I have a narrow understanding, if I provide you a narrow understanding, maybe someone can interpret this topic that we could subdue the enemy without actually fighting with a conventional war, without bringing into action your conventional forces, without mobilizing your tanks and artillery. Why not just infiltrate behind the enemy lines with spies, maybe with drones, so that actual war does not take place, but with that covert operations. Maybe you can hack their infrastructure, their supply lines, so that the war does not take place, but you have pressurized the enemy to comply to your choices. So this is just one this is one understanding, which I would call rather narrow understanding, because this is not the best understanding that I think could be of this essay topic. Okay, so the first one is to take up some covert operations. What is covert? Means hidden, छुपे हुए और बहुत ही precise surgical ways से you break the spine of the enemy. This is one way. Second is psychological warfare. Today this is the time of psychological warfare. And how can you engage in psychological warfare? You can engage in psychological warfare by breaking the confidence of the enemy, eroding the confidence of enemy. And how do you erode the confidence of enemy? You can erode the confidence of enemy in many ways, and there are two aspects of it. First is erode the confidence of their military forces. Break the spine of their intellect and their confidence. Their military forces should be left with no confidence on their capabilities. How can you do those psychological things? There's a whole mechanism behind it, but due to time restrictions, I'll move to the next point. And the next point is erode the confidence of the citizens, people from whom these military forces draw their strengths. The citizens themselves of the enemy should be left with this thought that their armies are not in a position to defend. So they must comply to to the wishes of their adversaries. This is the second point. Okay, so this psychological warfare. But third now, I'm moving towards that interpretation of this topic, which I think is the best, is the closest, and that is, how do you subdue the enemy? You subdue the enemy, again, that is related to the mind. You play with their mind. You play with their mind and you make your enemy believe that your interest and the interest of enemy are same. You make them do certain things by their own will, by their consent. With their consent, with their will, you make them do those things which you want to do. And you will say, how is this possible? This is possible. And for this, I don't have to take recourse to British history or to world history or to World War or to what happened thousands of years ago, even very recently. We are living in an age where global superpowers or major powers, they can topple the regimes in a country by infiltrating in civil society, by mobilizing protests. For example, in Bangladesh, what happened? The whole regime of a particular country can be toppled if a global superpower or some powers, they believe that they are not acting in their interests. So without firing a single bullet, we have many instances in our history, in our contemporary history, in our very modern time, 2025 itself, 24 itself, where some leaders have been eliminated with the help of local population. You did not fire a single bullet, but still you got your work done. So this is one of the best way to fight a war. You're not even fighting a bullet. And if I extend this further, this playing with this game, now I will take help of history here. When Britishers came to India, how did they fight war? One of you were talking about British history, Maratha Empire and other things which you should talk. I want to extend this idea. How could Britishers colonize Indians? They could colonize Indians, one is through divide and rule policy. And if you remember, the first war in which Mir Jafar, he switched Battle of Plassey, 1757, not even one bullet was fired. It was just some cheat. Our military general, he switched the sides. He switched allies. And thereafter also, Britishers, they entered into treaties of subsidiary alliances, treaty of this alliance and so on. Then they engaged in divide and rule. So yes, they fought wars, but the number of wars were not to that extent which might have been required if they had not pursued that policies of divide and rule and controlling in mind. And after that, when 1857 war occurred, how could Britishers defeat our entire population? 1857 war, Britishers could win because they could convince Indians, majority of Indians, that British rule was in our favor. If I tell you a historical fact, in 1857, middle class, especially the Bengali middle class, did not support sepoys. They did not support Indian freedom fighters at that point of time because they thought that British rule was good for us. Britishers would take our country forward. They would modernize our country. This is how Britishers could colonize us. So not just with the help of bullets, but they controlled our mind. They subdued us for centuries. And likewise, when we had to fight against Britishers to get our freedom, to own our soul and respect back, then what Mahatma Gandhi did, or what these freedom fighters did, even before Mahatma Gandhi. What our freedom fighters did? Our freedom fighters slowly, they convinced every social group that it is in their favor to fight against Britishers. So first, it was the middle class which was convinced that it is in your favor to fight against Britishers. And rather, before middle class, the first who rebelled against Britishers were the tribals. The tribal people, the tribal uprising. Then peasant class, peasants mean farmers. Then farmers were brought in within the folds of national movements. After that, middle class was brought in the folds of national movement. And finally, army was brought in the field of, in the folds of freedom movement. Many of you might think that what is the role of Subhash Chandra Bose? Subhash Chandra Bose and Mahatma Gandhi, they are not opposite. They are not poles apart. They are two sides of the same coin. They both wanted to convince Indians that it is in their interest to fight against Britishers. Mahatma Gandhi was trying to convince Indian population, Indian demography, Indian women, farmers, factory workers and everyone. While Subhash Chandra Bose, what he did, he brought regiments of ex-Indian soldiers and ex-Indian soldiers of INA. They were fighting for freedom against the British army on the other side, which again consisted of Indians. So Indian soldiers within the British army, they realized, why are we fighting for whom we are fighting? And then that mutiny took place. Naval ratings in Bombay, in Karachi and in different places, people in uniform, which consisted of the core strength of Britishers, they rebelled against Britishers, and that was the time Britishers realized that it would be impossible for us just to stay in this country. So Britishers colonized us with the help of force, but more than force, they played psychological games with us. And when Indians had to get that freedom again from Britishers, when Indians had to free themselves, they also employed the same means, that one by one, every social group in India, from farmers, tribals, lower caste groups, untouchables, women, army people, navy, everyone was convinced that it is in our interest to fight against Britishers. That is how we could change history. That is how we could get our freedom back. So this is what it means. If you want to fight a war, there are ways beyond using brute force. There are ways beyond using violence, beyond using tanks and artillery and so on. Now, I'll give you some extra points to think about. Think on these lines. Is this topic relevant only for army? Only for military? Maybe not. Where can we else apply it? Even when there is no military war, even when there is no war between armies, we often see when one social group, it wants to dominate over the other social group. How does it do that? For example, I will bring in some ideas of social scientists. Feminists, for example, what they would argue, that how have men oppressed women? How have men controlled women? By convincing women that it is in their benefit that they comply to a system which has been constructed by men. Likewise, different sort of oppressions that have took place not only in India, but everywhere in the world. How these social hierarchies have been maintained. How is social hierarchy maintained? Social hierarchy is maintained when the groups that exist at the bottom section of the social hierarchy, they are convinced, generations after generations, that it is in their benefit to act according to the wishes of the people sitting at the top. European history would show us, American history would show us, of course Indian history would also show us that one social group can be oppressed, can be controlled, can be manipulated if you can play with their mind, if you can teach them some lessons of morality, ethics and law which comply to your wishes. So you don't have to use your lathis and chains of iron to control. You don't have to threaten them with violence, but you can use some other means also. Okay, so these are certain interpretations of this topic. One more interpretation that I missed earlier was, you could have added, was that you could have overwhelming force. Suppose we have overwhelming force. Overwhelming force, you mean? Overwhelming force which is disproportionately more than your adversary. So they would be afraid even to fire a single bullet at you. That could also be one interpretation. Okay, so earlier, I think in the previous session, I told you about this example of how you can interpret this topic across. You can start with India-Pakistan, for example. How we want certain things. We want Pakistan to do certain things, especially abandon its policy of sponsoring cross-border terrorism. So how we can do that? Of course, we can use our might. We have Rafales also. We have BrahMos. We have all those weapons. We have our aircraft carriers. We have all those things. But there are other means also which we should explore. And those means, diplomacy and psychological warfare, all these things are important. Now, this topic can be explained across these lines. I think we all have understood it. But the sense here is, what next? Okay, if this topic is if the statement is true, if indeed the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, what are the lessons to be learned from this? What are the lessons to be learned from us? We are a peace-loving nation. We are a peace-loving nation. We don't want to fight a war with anyone. We for thousands of years, we never launched. We were never an aggressor. We defended our country with courage, but we were never the aggressors. We don't intend to be an aggressor, so why this statement is important to us? The statement is important for us to know because we may not want to grab territories of others, but what about our adversaries? There is a famous statement that if you do not have a seat on a dining table, if suppose different world powers are having a discussion across a table, some table conference or some discussion they are having, some meeting they are having, and if you do not have a seat at the table, then you are on the table, you are the dish on the table. The point here is, if you will not defend yourself, if you will not prepare yourself, you would be grabbed by others. Others would come and encroach your territory, encroach your country, will take away your resources. So we have to be cautious. Our civil society has to be cautious. Our economic people who engage in commerce, they have to be cautious that in these many ways the enemy can also play tricks upon us. So we have to be cautious that we do not fall victim to the games that enemy might want to play upon us. Next, I also want to take forward that this topic is in no way suggesting that we go for peace only. Yes, one of the best way to get things done is to convince your adversary that, okay, be friends with each other. Let us be friends. You can, instead of making somebody your adversary, you can make them your ally. This happens at the international level also, and this happens in our personal relationships also. So if you meet a person for the first time, or your friends, or your relatives, or your spouse, either you can fight with them, or you can make friendship with them. So rather than fighting and using confrontation to get your work done, you can also use friendship and peaceful and mutual coexistence and the ideas, and you can convince them then how it is important and better for them to act according to mutual benefit, so that both of you can take benefit. But being said that, there's a lesson that I wanted to draw here towards the end. I would say this topic is important because so that we defend ourselves from our enemies. Okay, and the second part is there is that we should not be passive. There is a very famous line of रामधारी सिंह दिनकर, क्षमा शोभती उस भुजंग को जिसके पास घरल हो, उसको क्या जो दंतहीन विषरहित विनीत सरल हो. So what is said, that forgiveness and all this passive and behavior, it is suitable to that snake which has venom, which has poison, which has a strength, not to that snake, not to that cobra which has lost its teeth. So in order to talk about these means which go beyond power, you must own power first of all. So this topic is not suggesting that we abandon our policy of development of BrahMos or development of 5th generation, 6th generation fighters. We must have the strongest army, the strongest navy, the best air force in the world. We should have them in order to be in a position where we can use extra means beyond brute force. Just because there are ways where you can use, where you can get your things done without force, does not mean that we abandon force. Likewise, there is a very famous statement, I think Winston Churchill or maybe someone else said this, that peace can be won only from the position of strength. If you want to win peace, you have to gain strength also. And likewise, if you want peace, be prepared for war. So if you want peace, you have to be prepared for war. So we should not shy away from using brute force. We must be prepared for them. And once we have prepared for them, once we have the willpower for them, then we should look after other means also. Diplomacy and all those things, and covert unconventional warfare, psychological warfare, convincing our enemies, diplomacy, treaties, all these things are important. Using our commerce, our industries, and all those means, using propagation of ideology, making good cinema, using soft power, and all those things are important to convince your enemy that you should not be someone with whom he should mess up. Okay? So these are some of the ways in which you could have interpreted this topic.